this is Mike Curley from the C Team, continuing the series on the Dresden Files RPG system. And today we're doing a video that a lot of you have actually asked for. We're going to talk about Evocation. So, first, what is Evocation? The simplest way to put it is it's battle magic. If you've read the books, this is when Harry's throwing a fireball, when Ramirez is throwing a water blast at somebody. This is what you're doing turn to turn as attacks, blocks, maneuver, and as I just mentioned, water, fire, it's linked to the elements, and there's a few different ways to do it when you're setting up your character. You can go with the classical elements, which are earth, fire, wind, water, and spirit, not heart, spirit, which is kind of a generalist element. It's just basically pure energy or etherealness. It's kind of a catch-all. A lot of people use that as their primary or first element. Now, you could also do other elemental systems, like you could go with the Eastern elements, which are earth, fire, wood, metal, and water. Or you could do a mishmash that fits your character. It's up to you what you can sell to your GM. And an important thing to remember is elements have or even are aspects. A fire attack might be compelled a different way than a water attack would. You might be able to invoke something with your earth attack that you wouldn't with a wood or metal attack. So it's something to think about when you're choosing elements for your different types of spells. Now there's actually two powers that give you evocation, channeling and evocation. Channeling is kind of your starter version. You pick one element and that's it. You have the one element that you can do things with. Think, your firebenders or something like that, or pyromancers, whatever you want to call them. They specialize in one element. Evocation is an upgrade to that, where you have two or more elements, and you also get what's called a specialization, which is a +1 bonus to either power or control for one of your chosen elements. Harry, for example, to no one's surprise, has a +1 to fire power. So that's something we're going to get into a little later on. Now, what can you do with it? Mostly fairly simple and instant effects. These are basically you take a bunch of energy and you move it somewhere. You do something with it. You throw up a shield for a few seconds. You hurl a fireball. You bring down a metal scaffolding on somebody. You hex the lights. You freeze the water on the ground. This is just very quick. Just blink and it happens. The more complicated, more time-consuming stuff and more longer-lasting stuff, that's in thaumaturgy, and we're going to do that in another video. Okay, so the mechanics. How does it work? It works in two steps. First, you call up the power, and that's based on what I call your effective conviction. Now, when I say effective conviction, that means your conviction plus any specializations or bonuses from other things like focus items. So the way it works is you take one mental stress hit for every spell you cast in Evocation, and the amount of stress you take is based on how much power you put in compared to your base or effective conviction. So if you had an effective conviction of, say, 3, then you would be able to throw off a 3 power spell for 1 mental stress. If you wanted to use a 4 power spell, that would fill your second mental stress box, etc., up to 6. A power 6 spell would fill your 4th stress box. And yes, you can take mental consequences for this if you're that desperate. Now, control. That is based on your effective discipline, and this is where you actually roll. You do not roll conviction when you're deciding the power of a spell. So, say you decided to do a 5-shift spell. You want to really hit somebody with a really big fireball. What you do is you roll discipline to harness that power, to control it. So if you're using a weapon 5 fireball, you need to meet or exceed 5 on your discipline roll to use it properly. If you don't, you take something called Backlash or Fallout, which we're going to get into in a second. Now, the other thing you can do with it is kind of mundane effects, which are kind of like cantrips or scene setting. Like, you don't have to cast, and these are free. If you're just, walking into the room and turning on or lighting your candles with a quickie fire spell, or you're just quickly closing the door, that's just scene setting, that's free. You only have to spend shifts of stress or make a roll for it if you're doing it to achieve some kind of effect in battle or against someone else. So if you wanted to if you were just using a wind spell to snuff out your lights before you went to bed, that's nothing. If you're doing it to snuff out the lights so that your enemies are blinded and can't see you, then it would be a spell you have to actually cast. Okay, so Backlash and Fallout. This is what happens if you blow the roll. If you hurl that 5-shift fireball, but you only roll a 2 or a 3. First is Backlash, where you take the stress to force the spell to work. So in the example of the fireball, if you rolled a 3, you could take a 2-shift hit. It could be either mental or physical, but you have to choose one or the other. You can't split like 1 shift mental, 1 shift physical, which you wouldn't really want to do anyway because that more hits is always bad. So yeah, so say you're calling up a 5-shift block even, and you roll a 2, then you take a 3-shift hit. And when you do that, the spell works as intended. The block goes off at the full 5 shifts, the attack keeps its full power, but it doesn't boost the attack roll, and we're going to get into that in a little later. Now, Fallout is the opposite, where you just let the shifts go, where you go to hurl that 5-shift fireball, you roll a 3, and you decide, okay, I can't take the extra hit, I'm just going to let it go as a 3-shift fireball. The GM gets to decide what happens with those shifts. And he's kind of encouraged, he can't hurt you directly, but he's kind of encouraged to use them against you. So, say you blow the roll on the fireball. Okay, so some of it splashes off, and you're in a burning building now. Say you blow the roll on a water block. You're being attacked, you put up the block, but you lose 3 shifts. The floor gets all wet and you might slip. So, it's kind of a risk-reward thing where you have to consider where you are, how much you can take, and you have to worry about these kinds of things. It's kind of these two things, Backlash and Fallout, are the biggest drawbacks to being a wizard and having the magical powers. That it's roll to roll, you could pull off something really good, or you could take a really big hit, or you can screw over your teammates. It's not all or nothing though. Say if you cast a spell and you would be taking 6 shifts of Fallout or Backlash. You can split it up. You could split it up between Backlash and Fallout. So you could decide, okay, I want to take a 3-shift hit for Backlash, but the rest can go as Fallout. So that is within your control. You can kind of hit a middle ground if it's too big of a hit to risk either way. Okay, so now we're going to get into a little more detail about what you can do with it. And the first is, I've been talking about fireballs, obviously attack. So the weapon rating of the spell is based on your effective conviction. As we said before, you decide how much power is putting into the spell. So if you have an effective conviction for fire for 3, for 1 shift, you would get a 3-shift hit. A 3-shift, 3-weapon attack. And that goes up. So 3, 4, 5, 6. And then you roll discipline, as we said, to control. And this is also your targeting roll. So you kind of want this to be better if you're going to focus on being a blaster mage. So say you hit that 5-shift fireball and you ace the roll. You roll a 6. Then your target has to beat a 6 to dodge it. The important thing to remember here is that Backlash does not boost the targeting roll. So if you fire that weapon 6 fireball to incinerate somebody, but you only roll a 2, keep in mind that if you take the Backlash to keep it weapon 6, your enemy only has to beat a 2. So a lot of times, especially with high power attacks, it's not worth it to take the Backlash. Now, you have some options here that you don't have with other types of attacks. For example, you can make it a zone-wide attack by devoting 2 shifts of your spell to that attack. So back to the 5-shift fireball, you can make that a zone-wide attack of weapon 3 instead. So you have 5 shifts total, 3 in the weapon rating, 2 to make it zone-wide. You still have to roll a 5 to control it all, and everybody in the zone has to dodge that 5, including you or your ally. So this is a very tricky thing. The other thing you can do is a spray attack, where you take your attack and you split it up. So say you roll up a 6-shift water blast, and you have 2 guys you want to hit. You roll a 7. What you can do is you can divide those shifts any way you want to hit those 2 guys. So you could put a weapon 4 attack toward one guy with a 3 to hit, and a weapon 3 attack to the other guy with 4 to hit, and any combination in between. It's a little safer than the zone-wide attack, but you lose a bit of power on each. That's kind of one you want to do if, there's somebody you really don't want to hit in the zone. Okay, say you want to go on defense instead. You can create blocks with Evocation. These are, Harry's shield, a big wall of fire to keep people away from you, a wall of earth to intercept incoming fire. Again, this is based on your effective conviction. So if you have a 4 for the given element, your block strength would start at 4. You can use extra shifts of stress to make it 5, 6, or 7. And you roll discipline as usual. And as with other blocks, this isn't an opposed roll. The roll is just to control the spell. And by default, the effect lasts until your next turn. But you can devote shifts to duration. So say you want a 4 block up for 3 rounds. You can use a 6 shift spell to create that 4 block, and each shift adds an additional round. So it would last for the end of to the start of your 3rd turn afterward. Now, an important thing to remember is, unlike other blocks, if an opponent beats the magical block, the block ends. So even if you put in duration, if somebody rolls a 5 against you on that first round, it goes. So again, it's a risk-reward thing. A kind of safer option here is to make it armor. Now this cuts the effect in half, but it reduces the amount of damage you take. So that 4 shift block could be armor 2 for 3 rounds, and then even if you take an attack, it still protects you, reduces damage, and sticks around. A lot of wizards will have some kind of combination of these, so they can avoid attacks and avoid the damage. That gets expensive unless you're using enchanted items, which we'll get into in another video. And again, as with the attack, you can devote 2 shifts to make it encompass a group. So you could put block 4 over your whole party by using a 6 shift spell. Again, maneuver, it works like everything else. You set the power with your effective conviction, and then you roll discipline to control it. And these can be offensive or defensive. A lot of times that might be linked to the type of element and what you want to accomplish. By default, you need at least 3 shifts of effect to create a maneuver, to create an aspect. But if you're doing it against somebody and they have a resisting skill that's at least 3, you need to make your spell higher as well. Now the rules as written are kind of unclear if this is an opposed roll, whether the opponent gets to roll to avoid the maneuver or whether you just have to beat their resisting skill. So that's kind of the GM's call. I've kind of always done it the first way, where if you set the maneuver, the opponent has to beat it as if you were doing it normally, but either way is valid. And again, you can add duration. If you want to create a whirlwind and have it keep going for 3 rounds, add a couple shifts and keep it going. Zone-wide effects are really more scene aspects, and they're actually cheaper. As I said, an aspect is 3 shifts by default. So if you want to affect the entire zone with that whirlwind, you just make it a scene effect instead of against everybody. You only get like the 1 tag there, but it's still kind of a little cheaper, a little easier to deal with. And something unique to Evocation, you realize we've been going down through the actions in combat, but this one is Counterspell. And that is to remove someone else's spell effect, usually a block or a conjuration, a construct. If you're being attacked by a zombie, for instance, you could use a counterspell to just nullify the spell, activating it, and that's it. That takes them out. You can't really do it reflexively on a block. It's not like D&D where you can counterspell an active like fireball coming at you, but it is still pretty useful. And how that works, you actually get a free action as an assessment with lore, first to determine how many shifts you need. Because you need to devote as many shifts to the counterspell as the spell effect usually. And if you use too little, then it fizzles out. If you're trying to undo a 4-shift block but you only put 3 shifts in the counterspell, nothing happens. There's no real downside to overdoing it, except, of course, the usual risks of Backlash and Fallout. So if you wanted to, you roll lore and say you get a 5, and the GM says, okay, his block is 5, what do you want to do? You would need to use at least 5 shifts on your counterspell to remove that block. Now, a question that comes up a lot is whether you can use blocks or counterspells just defensively as reflex. And as I said with counterspells, you cannot. And by the rules as written in your story, no. Although the Paranet Papers has an update that does have rules for it. The main thing is when you do this, you can't add duration, And you also forego your defense roll because you're using the block as the defense roll. Remember what I said in the combat and conflicts video. If you have a block against you being attacked, you still get a defense roll. And that applies with magical blocks as well. But it would not apply if you use that defensively. And it's kind of risky either way, because if you take the hit, you're taking a physical hit. If you go to throw up a block, you're taking a mental shift hit and a potentially physical shift hit anyway if you are, you need to take backlash or fallout, and you still might get hit. So it's kind of another risk-reward thing. I would only really recommend trying it if it's like some huge ungodly thing that you absolutely have to dodge or you'll die. But otherwise, work it out with your GM. And you'll notice of the main combat actions, sprint is not in there. Because it's technically possible, and in the books there's once in a while where Harry kind of kamehamehas his way across the arena to avoid a hit. But again, it's sort of like rocket jumping or throwing yourself out of a cannon. You're not going to zip yourself around like the Flash. It's more like, hurl yourself in that direction at 30 miles an hour and hope you don't hit a wall. A lot of times your GM is kind of encouraged to make that work against you because it's not that kind of precision as far as the rules as written go. Okay, as I was saying before, I was talking about effective conviction, effective discipline, and what I'm referring to there are specializations and foci, or focus items. Now, evocation comes with one specialization. As I said before, it's a +1 to either power or control for one element. For example, I have a character I'm playing now named Calvin. He's kind of a geomancer type, and his base conviction is 3, but for Earth he has a +1 to power. So that when he uses wood or water spells, by default his power is 3, but he gets a little extra kick with Earth. He can put a little more into it. And there's a power called refinement that you can use to buy additional specializations. And it kind of works like the skill tree where you have to stack it. So refinement gives you +2 to something, or rather it gives you 2 +1s or 2 focus item slots. So for the specialization, let's say Calvin buys a refinement. He can't put both of them on Earth right away. He can't just give himself +3 to Earth power. He has to give +1 to something else to even get Earth up to 2. So he might put +1 to power for wood so he can put Earth at +2. Or he might give +1 to Earth control to get Earth power +2. So that's kind of the balancing act. You can't just put all of your points into one thing to just make it ungodly powerful. Now both channeling and evocation come with 2 focus slots, and these are to make focus items. Those are things like a ring to focus your defensive spells, a blasting rod. And what they do is they are +1 to either offensive power, offensive control, defensive power, or defensive control of one element. So whereas Calvin's specialization gives him just +1 to all Earth spells as far as power goes, if he wanted to make a focus item, he would have to choose. Do you want it offensive power or defensive power? Offensive control or defensive control? And there is some limits here where the smaller items can have fewer slots, but that kind of rarely comes up. You can't get like 6 slots into a single ring, but a staff can hold more. An important thing to remember is multiple focus items won't stack for the same thing. So if you have 2 separate rods that both give +1 power to fire, you can't use them both to use +2. But you can if one is control and one is power, you can use them both, but they wouldn't stack otherwise. And another important thing to remember is while a single item can work with multiple elements, each element needs to have the same bonuses. So for example, if you wanted to make a staff, if you had a staff that had +1 to Earth power and +1 to Earth discipline, both for offense, if you wanted to add water as an element, it would also need to have +1 power and +1 control for offense in water. So it kind of works to double up. It's generally more efficient to just have separate items. There's really not a lot of benefit to having all of your eggs in one basket. It gets expensive really quickly, but it is possible. Now another aspect of evocation is rote spells. Now these are your bread and butter spells. The idea here is these are spells that you have cast so much, so often, that you know them by heart. And for the most part, you cannot fail the control roll. It's treated as if your discipline rolled neutral. So if you have a discipline in 4, it treats it as you rolled 0 on the dice, so it's 4. If you're using this for an attack spell, you still do need to roll to control, but again, you're not going to worry about backlash or conviction. For example, Calvin, he's got a power 5 earth attack that's zone wide. And he has the earth specialization, so his effective conviction is 4, and a focus item glove for offensive control that gives him the effective discipline of 5 for that. Now the rote is 5 shift, so it is a 2 stress hit to call it the power, but he's not looking at backlash or fallout. He still has to target it, and he can still blow that roll, but he's not going to cause any damage he wasn't intending to in the first place. Now the number of rote spells you have is equal to your lore. Now one other thing you can do is if you have a focus item that is linked to a rote spell, then you have to use it. For that rote spell of Calvin's, he needs to have the glove with the focus item on it, otherwise he just has to roll it out straight. So that's another thing, that's why Harry always gets worried when he doesn't have his blasting rod, because by the book, his rote Fuego is linked to the blasting rod. So when he doesn't have it, he's much more likely to set things on fire he's not actually trying to. Now the other option here is if your focus item is only used for that rote. If Calvin only used that glove for that specific spell and couldn't use it for anything else, you get a bonus +1. Now this is handy, but it's not really used that often, because generally you want the more broad +1 to all the spells you might cast with it than the +1 to that specific spell. It's rare to find a spell that is always useful in every situation. You're going to want to change it up. Now the final thing you can do with Evocation is redirect your spell energy. As I was saying before, a lot of spell types can have duration, like maneuvers or blocks, and I've even seen some arguments for attack spells that might have duration, although those aren't really specifically mentioned in the book. Now, for this to work, the spell must have duration going into your turn. So it must have lasted from a previous turn that you specifically said it's got extra duration. So these are the blocks that you set up for 2 or 3 turns, the windmill or the whirlwind that you have set up for most of the battle. And it must not have been used for its current function this round since your last turn. So you couldn't have blocked anything with that block. You couldn't have tagged that whirlwind to knock somebody off their feet. And it has to make sense. It has to stay within the element and make sense. You couldn't take the energy from a fire spell and turn it into an earth block. You could try turning it into an earth or into a fire block or fire maneuver of some kind. And it acts as kind of a free spell. You don't have to call up the power again because it's already out there. And it's a spell of equal value to the remaining shift value of the previous spell. So going back to Calvin, he has a wooden shield rote. Gives him armor 1 for 3 rounds. And that it's a 4 shift spell. So say he calls it up, but he goes around without being hit. So that's 1 round of duration down. On his next turn, he keeps going, he still isn't getting hit. But he's been casting other spells, he's running dry. So by the end of his last turn, he's got the 2 shift effect left. So what he can do is take that shield, that energy, roll discipline again as an attack, and punch somebody with the shield or hurl it at somebody. And it's a way to kind of redirect a spell that hasn't been working or hasn't been as useful as you want it to. And that kind of sums up the straight mechanics of Evocation. Its biggest benefit is that it's flexible. It's not like D&D where you have a specific spell with a specific use that does a specific amount of damage. This is kind of all up to you. You decide what you want to do, how much power you want to put into it, and it really allows for a lot of customization of your character. If you read the books, you'll notice every single spellcaster casts in a different way. Those might all mechanically be the same, but it adds a little bit of flair and a little bit of character to your player character. Okay, we'll see you next time, where I'll be going over thaumaturgy.